They told me to stay in my room because I was too young to understand what was being discussed. The door closed gently, but the voices on the other side carried secrets I was never meant to hear. I stood still, realizing my name had already been mentioned before I was excluded. That was the moment I knew this meeting wasn't meant to protect me. It was meant to decide something about me. Before the story continues, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss stories where silence reveals more than words ever could. I didn't argue when they asked me to leave. I nodded politely, like a child who accepts rules without question. That was what they expected from me: obedience, not awareness. I walked down the hallway slowly, each step heavier than the last, pretending I was going to my room, but I didn't. I stopped just short of the corner where the hallway curved toward the living room. The voices were clearer there, softened by distance, but still sharp enough to understand. I leaned against the wall, my heart beating harder than it should have. At first, it sounded like any other family discussion: calm voices, careful wording, people clearing their throats before speaking. Then someone said my name again, and everything changed. They spoke as if I wasn't part of the family, more like a topic on an agenda. One voice said I was still young and wouldn't understand the reasons. Another said it was better this way, easier in the long run. No one asked what I thought. No one wondered how it might feel. I listened as decisions were discussed, framed as concern but shaped by convenience. They weren't talking about my safety. They were talking about control, about keeping things simple, about avoiding questions. I felt something settle in my chest, not panic, not anger, but clarity. They weren't hiding this from me because it was complicated. They were hiding it because it would be hard to justify. The meeting continued, and the longer I listened, the more I realized how practiced this conversation was. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't emotional. It had been planned. Someone said, "She'll accept it. She always does." Another replied, "By the time she understands, it'll be too late to change." That sentence stayed with me. Too late to change. I pressed my fingers into my palm to stay grounded. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to interrupt. I wanted to hear everything. Because once you know the full truth, you can't be guided blindly anymore. They talked about my future like it was a document already drafted. Not cruelly, calmly. That was the worst part. They truly believed they were being reasonable. I learned something important in that hallway. Betrayal doesn't always come wrapped in anger. Sometimes it arrives gently, spoken by people who think they know better than you. Eventually, chairs shifted. The meeting was ending. I stepped back quietly and walked to my room before anyone opened the door. I sat on my bed and stared at the wall, replaying every word. When someone knocked later and told me I could come back, I smiled and thanked them. I acted normal. I didn't ask questions. That confused them. At dinner, they spoke to me carefully, like people handling something fragile. They asked about school, about small things. No one mentioned the meeting. I answered politely. Inside, though, something had changed. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind was organizing information. I realized that the advantage I had now was knowledge. They thought I was unaware. That gave me time. Time to watch. Time to understand. Time to decide how and when I would speak. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in how they treated me. More reassurance. More vague statements about the future, less detail. They were managing a narrative. I played along. I listened more than I spoke. I asked harmless questions that revealed nothing. I paid attention to who avoided eye contact when certain topics came up, who spoke too confidently, who stayed silent. Everyone had a role. One afternoon, someone slipped and said something that confirmed everything I had heard outside that door. They immediately corrected themselves, smiling too quickly. I smiled back. They had no idea how much I already knew. What they didn't realize was that by excluding me from that meeting, they had given me space to think without pressure, without emotional manipulation, without being told what was best for me. And in that space, I found something powerful: patience. I didn't want to confront them, not yet. If I did, they would minimize, deny, or soften the truth. They would say they were protecting me. I wanted them to reveal themselves through actions. So I waited. I watched decisions unfold quietly. I noticed who benefited most from the plan, who pushed it forward, who hesitated but stayed silent anyway. That's when I understood where the real betrayal was coming from. And once I saw that clearly, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Because revenge doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like letting people believe their secret is safe, just long enough for it to undo them on its own. And that realization followed me into the next phase of this story, where listening turned into strategy, and silence became the most powerful choice I had ever made. The next few days passed in a strange quiet. On the surface, everything felt normal, too normal. Meals were shared, routines followed, small conversations filled the air. But underneath it all, I felt like I was standing in the middle of a carefully staged performance. They were acting. And once you notice that, it becomes impossible to unsee. I paid attention to who spoke first whenever decisions were mentioned. I noticed how one person always redirected the conversation when details came too close to what I had overheard. Another avoided the topic entirely, changing subjects with forced laughter. They were all connected to that meeting, whether they wanted to admit it or not. I realized then that the meeting hadn't been about a single decision. It had been about alignment, making sure everyone agreed before I ever had the chance to question anything. That knowledge gave me clarity, not fear. I stopped reacting emotionally. Instead, I observed patterns. I watched how information traveled, who controlled it, and who benefited most from my silence. One evening, someone casually mentioned a future plan that hadn't existed before the meeting. They framed it as an idea, but their tone carried certainty. I nodded and asked a simple question that sounded innocent. Who decided that? The room went quiet for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for me to notice. Someone answered quickly, too quickly. "It just makes sense," they said. "Everyone agrees." That was a lie. I knew exactly who had hesitated during the meeting. I had heard the uncertainty in their voice through the wall. They hadn't agreed. They had just stopped objecting. That distinction mattered. I decided to approach them quietly, not with accusations, but with curiosity. One afternoon, when we were alone, I asked what they thought about the plan everyone kept mentioning. They paused before answering. Then, they admitted they weren't fully comfortable with it, but felt pressured to go along. They said they didn't want conflict, that they thought I'd adjust eventually. I didn't argue. I thanked them for being honest. That moment told me everything I needed to know. The plan survived not because it was right, but because people were afraid to disrupt it. Fear thrives in silence, but silence can also expose fear. I didn't rush. I let time stretch. I continued acting unaware. Meanwhile, I made small choices that subtly challenged the narrative. I asked questions in group settings that forced clarification. I expressed preferences calmly, without defiance. Each time, I watched reactions carefully. Some people became nervous, others defensive. A few looked relieved. Those reactions mapped the truth more clearly than words ever could. One night, I heard raised voices behind a closed door. Not shouting, controlled tension. Someone said things were getting complicated. Someone else insisted it would work itself out. That's when I knew the plan was weakening. They hadn't expected resistance, even quiet resistance. They had expected acceptance. I realized then that my age had never been the issue. My awareness was. The more I stayed calm, the more unsettled they became. They began over-explaining, offering reassurances I hadn't asked for, trying to soften something that hadn't yet happened. People only do that when they feel exposed. I started keeping track mentally. Who said what, when, and how often. Inconsistencies appeared quickly. Stories shifted. Justifications changed. I never corrected them. Instead, I remembered. One afternoon, someone made a statement that directly contradicted what they had said earlier in the week. They didn't notice. I did. That contradiction wasn't accidental. It revealed who was shaping the story as it went along. That night, I lay awake thinking about what I wanted. Not revenge in the dramatic sense, not punishment. I wanted autonomy. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted them to understand that excluding me had consequences. But I didn't want to force it. I wanted them to arrive there themselves. So I did something unexpected. I stopped being agreeable. Not confrontational, just honest. When asked my opinion, I gave it calmly. When assumptions were made, I gently corrected them. When vague statements were offered, I asked for clarity. The effect was immediate. Meetings were postponed, decisions delayed, conversations ended abruptly, silence returned. But this time, it wasn't imposed on me. It was spreading among them. They had lost control of the timeline, and that scared them more than any argument could. One evening, someone finally asked me directly what I knew. I looked at them and said the truth, but not all of it. I said I knew enough to understand that things had been decided without me, that I wasn't angry, but I wasn't comfortable either. Their face changed. They realized then that the secret wasn't safe anymore, not because I threatened to expose it, but because I had already stepped outside the role they had assigned me. From that moment on, everything shifted. The plan had to be reconsidered, discussions reopened. Voices that had been quiet before started speaking again. The unity they had worked so hard to create was dissolving, and all I had done was listen, wait, and choose my moment carefully. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply made it clear that decisions about me could no longer happen without me. And as the truth continued unfolding, I understood that the real power I gained that day wasn't information, it was timing. Because once people realize you've been listening all along, they can never speak about you the same way again. After that conversation, the atmosphere in the house changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. People became cautious around me, choosing their words more carefully, checking expressions before continuing. It wasn't fear exactly, it was uncertainty. They no longer knew what I knew, and that unsettled them. For the first time, I wasn't being managed. I noticed how plans were now discussed in smaller groups, how conversations paused when I entered a room. It was almost ironic. They had excluded me before because I was too young, and now they were unsure how to include me without losing control. I didn't push. I let the discomfort sit. One person, the same one who had admitted their doubts earlier, started speaking up more openly. Not dramatically, just with small questions that slowed everything down. Are we sure this is the right timing? Have we actually asked her how she feels? What if this isn't the best option anymore? Those questions landed harder than accusations ever could. Others resisted at first. They tried to frame my calmness as confusion, my questions as hesitation. But that narrative didn't hold. I wasn't confused. I was precise, and precision is difficult to dismiss. I began to see the deeper structure behind the meeting I had been excluded from. It wasn't just about one decision. It was about maintaining a hierarchy. Adults decide, younger voices adapt. That order had worked for them for years. Until it didn't. One evening, someone finally tried to reassert authority. They spoke firmly, reminding me that experience mattered, that decisions weren't made lightly. Their tone wasn't unkind, but it was dismissive. I listened. Then I said something simple. I understand experience, but experience doesn't mean my life stops being mine. The room went quiet. That sentence wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't meant to shock. It was just true. No one argued with it. That silence told me everything. From then on, discussions became slower, more fragmented. The original plan, the one discussed behind closed doors, was losing momentum. People started proposing alternatives, compromises, delays. The person who had benefited most from the original plan grew visibly frustrated. They pushed harder, spoke louder, tried to frame urgency as necessity. And that's when others started pulling away. Pressure exposes motives. I saw how alliances shifted, how people who had once nodded silently began questioning openly, how the unity they had carefully built fractured under scrutiny. And through it all, I stayed calm. Not because I wasn't affected, but because I knew the moment I became emotional, they would redirect the focus to my reaction instead of their actions. I wasn't going to give them that. One night, I overheard another argument. This time, my name wasn't mentioned. Instead, they spoke about losing control and underestimating her. That word, underestimating, felt strangely validating. They had underestimated my awareness, my patience, my ability to connect dots quietly. And now they were paying for it, not through punishment, but through loss of certainty. The secret was unraveling, not because it had been exposed publicly, but because it could no longer be contained. People started asking each other questions they hadn't dared to ask before, re-examining assumptions, revisiting decisions. The original justification no longer sounded convincing. At one point, someone admitted they had gone along with the plan simply because they trusted someone else's judgment more than their own. That admission changed everything. Because once trust is questioned, authority weakens. I realized then that the revenge I was witnessing wasn't something I had executed. It was something that emerged naturally when people were forced to confront the reality of their choices. All I had done was refuse to be silent when it mattered, and remain silent when silence was strategic. The meeting they had excluded me from had given them a false sense of control. Listening from outside had given me perspective, and perspective is dangerous to those who rely on secrecy. By the time the family sat down together again, this time with me present, the tone was different. There were no confident declarations, no settled decisions, only discussion. They asked me what I wanted, not rhetorically, not as a formality, genuinely. I answered honestly, without anger or accusation. I explained my concerns, my preferences, my boundaries. No one interrupted, no one dismissed me. The person who had once insisted I was too young to understand anything important didn't speak at all. That silence was louder than anything they had said before. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, because I knew that whatever happened next would include me, not because they wanted to be kind, but because they had learned I couldn't be ignored. The secret had lost its power, and as the truth continued settling into the spaces between us, I understood something important. Revenge doesn't always mean causing harm. Sometimes it means removing the comfort of secrecy and replacing it with accountability. And once accountability enters the room, everything changes. The days after that second meeting felt quieter, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible has happened. No one said it out loud, but we all knew the family wasn't going back to the way it was before. I noticed how people avoided making plans without checking with me first, not because they suddenly saw me as powerful, but because they no longer trusted their old assumptions. The certainty they once had that they knew what was best for everyone had cracked. One afternoon, I sat alone in the living room, the same place where I had been told I was too young to understand anything important. Sunlight came through the window, landing on the floor in long, quiet shapes. I thought about how easily my life could have been redirected without my knowledge, how close I had come to being moved like a piece on someone else's board. What hurt the most wasn't the plan itself. It was the realization that people who said they loved me had believed silence was safer than honesty. One of them finally spoke to me privately. Their voice was softer than I had ever heard it. They admitted they thought excluding me would protect me from stress, from responsibility, from conflict. They said they hadn't realized how much it would hurt to be left out. I listened carefully. Then I said, "Protection that ignores my voice doesn't protect me. It just protects the decision." They nodded slowly. I could see it land. Another person apologized later that week. Not dramatically, just a simple acknowledgement that they had chosen convenience over courage, that they had followed instead of questioned. Those apologies didn't erase what happened, but they mattered because they were honest. The person who had pushed hardest for the original plan never apologized. They didn't argue anymore either. They became distant, quieter, less central. It wasn't punishment, it was consequence. People stopped deferring to them automatically. That shift told me everything I needed to know. Over time, decisions became slower but more thoughtful. Discussions included pauses, questions, disagreements that were no longer hidden behind closed doors. It was messy, but it was real, and I was part of it. I realized then that what I had done, listening, waiting, choosing when to speak, had changed the balance without confrontation. I hadn't exposed anyone publicly. I hadn't demanded control. I had simply refused to disappear. One evening, I overheard someone say, "We should ask her first." They didn't notice me standing nearby. They said it naturally, without hesitation. That moment stayed with me, because it wasn't about permission anymore, it was about respect. I also learned something about myself. I learned that being young didn't mean being unaware, that silence can be a tool, not a weakness, and that speaking up doesn't always require volume, just timing. The family never formally acknowledged the meeting I wasn't invited to. It became an unspoken reference point, something everyone remembered but didn't name. In a strange way, that was fitting. Secrets lose power when they are no longer hidden, but also when they are no longer needed. Looking back, I don't feel anger, I feel clarity. They thought excluding me would keep things simple. Instead, it forced them to face questions they had avoided for years, not because I demanded answers, but because my presence made avoidance impossible. That was the real revenge. Not humiliation, not exposure, but change. Change that couldn't be undone. And now, when I'm told I'm too young to understand something, I don't argue. I listen. I observe, and I decide when my voice matters most. Because sometimes, the moment you're asked to leave the room is the moment you learn the most. And sometimes, the quietest person outside the door is the one who ends up changing everything.